Welcome back to the Monday Morning Point Guard podcast. On today's episode, going to be discussing the Brooklyn Nets. They just had one of the craziest seasons that I can remember any NBA team having. And obviously getting swept in the first round was a huge disappointment. So what do they need to do going forward into the offseason here to get back into a contender status? If you did enjoy the video, please be sure to like it as well as subscribe for weekly content. Also, the podcasts are now up on Spotify, so you can listen to the full episode uninterrupted there. And if there's a spot you agree with, disagree with, either reach out to us on Twitter or in that comment section, and we'd love to discuss with you. If someone had told me before the season started over the summer that Kyrie Irving, James Harden, and Kevin Durant would all be healthy entering the playoffs and were healthy for the playoffs, but the Nets were going to be swept in the first round, I might have asked if time travel was invented and someone brought the dream team back. This was just about as tumultuous a season as we have seen in the NBA, but it's really hard to feel bad for the Nets since most of this was self-inflicted. And I really don't even know where to begin with this just insane season from the Nets. So let's just try to dive right into it. I guess, first of all, how crazy is it to think that after 3 seasons with the Nets, this Kyrie and Durant-led group would only have one playoff series win to show for it? Just one playoff series win in 3 years with this team. And given the fact that Kyrie is a free agent this offseason, that might just be where this story ends. And I know Kyrie has said that he's going to resign with the team and that he's looking forward to managing this team with Kevin Durant and Sean Marks moving forward. But honestly, I trust Kyrie about as far as I could throw him. So who knows what he's going to end up doing with his free agency. And as far as the management piece of that, like, you have to just love that level of delusion from Kyrie Irving. Like, would anyone trust Kyrie to run their bath, much less an NBA franchise? I feel like in either situation there, either be it a bath or an NBA team, he's just bound to make everything worse. I could see Kyrie saying something like, well, I didn't want to waste water since it's a scarce resource, so I put sand in the tub instead. Also, does Kyrie think that he's nearly the same level of player that Kevin Durant is? And that's not even mentioning, like, what gives him the right? What does he think? What does he think gives him the right? He's played 103 regular season games with this team in 3 years, so he's barely been around. So why would anyone care what he has to say within that organization? I would say that Kyrie needs to read the room, but Kyrie's just a different dude. He's never going to do that, never going to be that type of guy. As far as the Nets season went, listen, obviously it was a huge disappointment, but given everything that they had to go through, it could have been so much worse for them. Entering the year, they were title contenders, and then right off the bat, they have to deal with this weird Kyrie situation where, because of his vaccination status, he's only going to be available part-time. So the team just says screw it and sends him home. And that was just a huge distraction right at the start of the year. And then because of that, it just seems like James Harden was kind of counting on Kyrie being there. Of course he was. And it seems like Harden's plan was just to be sort of coasting through the regular season and kind of play his way into shape, because he came into this year just incredibly out of shape. And so that leads to James Harden getting frustrated with Kyrie and that whole situation. And then because Harden was so out of shape, Durant had to take on more of a burden to carry the team. And so then Durant gets frustrated with Harden. And that kind of leads us to this version of James Harden that is everyone's favorite, the checked out version of James Harden. And while he's just mailing it in on the court, he never officially demanded a trade to my knowledge, but according to Woj, it was because he was afraid of potential backlash, and that, as if that story wouldn't come out. And even if that story didn't come out, we could just see the lack of effort. It was on full display on national TV for everyone to see. And then so if he got traded, especially to a team like Philadelphia, everyone would have been left to assume that was what he wanted anyway. So it's not as if he was going to come out looking great, giving up on the Nets like 13 months after they traded for him. So they end up dealing James Harden for Ben Simmons, Andre Drummond, Seth Curry, and a couple of picks. And this, for me, remains probably the most difficult trade to evaluate in my lifetime in terms of trying to determine a winner. On the 76ers side of things, yeah, great job. You turned Ben Simmons into James Harden. Even in a vacuum, that's really great. But if you combine that with the fact that It was a version of Ben Simmons who was refusing to play basketball after one of the biggest meltdowns in playoff history, which is all of our most recent memory of him. That's basically a miracle. But also on the 76ers side, when you're acquiring James Harden, he's in the last year of his deal and is eligible for this ludicrous contract extension, something like 4 years, 220 million. I would have real concerns about what that contract is going to look like even after next season, much less when Harden is moving into his late 30s. He just hasn't been that good this season. And the fact that he doesn't seem to take real great care of himself in terms of staying in shape, and he has put some serious miles and serious minutes on his body during his tenure in Houston. And those Houston minutes were really demanding minutes where he was just carrying them offensively year in and year out. I think it might be starting to catch up with him. And this is what happens to most athletes as they hit their mid 30s. They just aren't the same player. Guys like LeBron and Tom Brady have made us forget that guys age and aren't good forever. So that's a real concern on the Philly side of this trade. They moved a lot of their depth and some future assets to make this deal happen. And so all of their eggs are in the James Harden basket now in terms of trying to be a title contender going forward. And that doesn't seem like it's going to be a recipe for success, at least so far this season. And you might be saying, well, they don't have to offer him the max, do they? I think if they didn't, someone else definitely would. And even if you do bring him back, there's just no guarantee he doesn't nuclear option his way out of town again mid-contract like he has with both the Rockets and the Nets. So there's just no guarantee this works out for Philly. But I guess given that they turned this disgruntled Ben Simmons into James Harden, it's hard to be too mad about it. On the Nets side of things, they have plenty to feel excited about too. They were put into a horrible situation where they basically had no choice but to deal James Harden to Philly. No one else was going to trade for Harden with half a year left on his contract and basically announcing to the world that he only wants to play in Philadelphia. So for the Nets to be able to really round out their roster, get some picks back, and add a guy of Ben Simmons' talent, it seems like a very good deal considering they weren't able to create a bidding war for James Harden like they probably would have liked. But obviously, at the end of the day, Ben Simmons never even suited up for the Nets this season, and thus begins this whole crazy Ben Simmons saga where at first he says he just needs a couple of weeks to ramp up and then he'll be ready to play again. Then he has a setback with the back, and then we are waiting and waiting and waiting for him to come back. And then by the time the playoffs roll around, they say they're targeting like a game 3 or a game 4 for his return. But I knew, and I'm on the record, that I didn't think there was any chance that we would see him this season. I thought there was a 0% chance that he would play at all during the playoffs. Once we hit the playoffs and they're like, oh, we're waiting to see him in the middle of a really tough Celtics series. That just didn't make sense to me. And for the Nets side of things, this just really isn't what they signed up for. They were expecting to have Simmons within a couple of weeks after trading Harden. So when Simmons just kind of strings the Nets along as an organization for months of when he's going to play next, it's left them understandably frustrated. And I want to be as understanding to Ben's mental health as I possibly can be, but he's made this really difficult given his history to be empathetic towards him for this. Before the season with Philadelphia, he says basically, hey, trade me. I'm never going to play for you guys again. And then Philly says, well, if you don't show up, we're not going to pay you. So he shows up to practice for like 2 days and then starts complaining about a back injury. And then he joins up with the Nets, talks about how great he feels, and it's just going to take him a couple of weeks to ramp up, and he'll be back on the court, and he's really looking forward to it, and this and that and the other. And then he starts complaining about that same back injury. So we're all left with some pretty legitimate questions. I feel like, how did he hurt the back again? He hasn't been playing. Like, if it's the same back issue he had before the season even started, why wasn't he rehabbing and getting ready for his return? If this is a nagging injury, like a reoccurring issue in the back, that's obviously not good either. Back injuries are career altering type injuries. And now he's saying that, well, I have this mental block and the stress of a potential return to the basketball court is causing my back to hurt. And listen, all of those things could be true. Maybe his back was hurt when he was in Philadelphia before the season, before they asked him to show up. Maybe he was ready to go when he got to the Nets camp and then hurt the back while he was ramping up, but once he joined the Nets. And then maybe his stress is causing severe pain in his back. When I'm stressed out at work, I feel it in my shoulders, but if I had to get out there and play a basketball game for a couple $1,000,000, I think I could probably tough it out, but I don't know. So maybe all of this is true, but when you combine all of it together, it starts to sound just like too much of a coincidence. It just starts to sound like a convenient excuse to get out of playing basketball. And if I'm the Nets, I'd be really worried about this moving forward. If he's making up the back thing, who's to say he's not going to continue to make up injuries to avoid playing when the pressure is on, like in the playoffs? And at this stage, it's with Simmons, it's pretty clear that he doesn't love basketball, but are we even sure that he likes it at all at this stage? Simmons is basically the same player he entered the league as. Sure, he's improved defensively, but that seems to at least be like a more of a question of effort when he was at LSU as opposed to talent. So when he kind of joined the NBA, he kind of put forth a lot more effort on that end defensively, and he showed himself to be, potential defensive player of the year type defender when he wants to be. But offensively, can anyone name one thing that he's improved at? One thing. There really, in my mind, just isn't anything that he's gotten better at. And if you look at his stats on his basketball reference page, he's basically the same player year after year. It's the same shooting percentage, same free throw, same 3-point percentages roughly, and it's same rebounds, assists, points. It all looks the same. A dude who loves basketball would be in the gym, improving their game and adding to it year after year. That's something that even a guy as talented as LeBron has added over the years. Every year, it seems like he comes back with a different wrinkle, a different tool in the toolbox, something new. And it's because he's a gym rat. We haven't seen Ben Simmons in the time he's been in the league add anything at all. And as bad as Harden is when he demands a trade, at least he shows up to work, even if it is the mailing it in version. At least he's out there playing and available. So how could we not question Ben Simmons' love for the game in this situation? We've already seen players like Larry Sanders walk away from the game because of the pressure. It became too much. And Ben Simmons may very well decide to do the same thing. He may decide this is too much and I'm going to walk away. And I understand that. Listen, these guys live under a microscope where every move, every word, every decision they make is criticized and critiqued. That's a lot to deal with. And at the end of the day, not everyone can deal with that. As far as how the Nets season ended up, there's plenty of blame to go around here, but I've seen two people blame the most for their failings, and it's the classic ones, the team's best player in Kevin Durant and head coach Steve Nash. And while they aren't totally blameless here, I don't think they're the main problems with the Nets. It's just an oversimplification of what happened here. And it's just a classic take from the talking heads over at ESPN. It seems like they just never have a nuanced basketball take. For the Kevin Durant part of things, I agree. He had a bad series. He didn't shoot the ball well, and the Celtics defense really made life tough for him. But some of this Durant slander has gotten absolutely insane. The legacy stuff has just gotten really out of hand. I've seen people saying that Durant is no better than Allen Iverson. I don't know if I really need to explain why Kevin Durant and Iverson aren't on the same level. And listen, I love AI. I grew up watching basketball during his heyday. That was when I kind of really started to become an NBA fan. So I obviously love him. I think very highly of him. But having lived through that, Iverson is nowhere near as good as Kevin Durant. And I've seen some posts about how LeBron beat the same Celtics team back in 2018. And that's probably the dumbest thing I've seen so far. Even though the Celtics group is made up of basically the same players, it is not the same team as it was 4 years ago back in 2018. Tatum, Brown, and the rest of this group, they're now entering the primes of their career versus like Tatum's rookie year back in the 2018 playoffs. So I just think that's a ridiculous take. But probably the one that bothers me the most is the people who are viewing Kevin Durant drastically differently based on the result of this series. This is his second year back from an Achilles tear. He's in his 15th season. There is likely going to be some regression here. And every player has had a bad playoff series. Every great player has. I don't think that 20 years from now, when we're debating how great Kevin Durant was, someone will be like, yeah, Durant's not an all-time great, because remember that one really crazy Nets season where they got swept in the first round of the playoffs? Yeah, I'm not willing to consider Kevin Durant to be an all-time great for that. I don't care about the MVP, the scoring titles, and the fact that he was finals MVP on quite possibly the greatest team of all time. No, the fact that he got swept in the first round that one year, yeah, I can't consider him an all-time great anymore. That's just ridiculous. And I've seen some wild stuff about this being the series that pushed him outside of the top 10 of all time. And I'm sitting here like, when was Kevin Durant considered a top 10 player of all time? Outside of winning the title this season, I don't think he really has a case to be there. When you actually sit down and start to make the list, he just isn't there. And this is in no particular order, but let me just name off a couple names here. We have Michael Jordan, LeBron, Kareem, Bill Russell, Wilt Chamberlain, Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, Kobe, Tim Duncan. I don't think he has a case over any of those guys. And that's 9 names already. I haven't even mentioned Shaq, Hakeem, Dr. J, Oscar Robertson, guys like that. So he's just not a top 10 player in league history. He never was. Now, at the end of his career, if he is able to somehow turn this Nets thing around and win a couple more titles, sure. But if this is how his career ends up, he just doesn't have a case for it. For the Nash piece of this, sure, like Kevin Durant, this was not a good series for Steve Nash. He just didn't coach well, but I don't think he deserves to be fired. The reality is that they had both Ben Simmons and Joe Harris out. That's over $50 million in payroll they couldn't put on the court for this Celtics series. Do Ben Simmons and Joe Harris get them over the top as far as winning a series against the Celtics goes? Maybe, but probably not. I think it does make it a more closely contested series. All of these games were very close. I think the total spread for the series was like 12 points between the 4 games. So I think it's probably a 6 or 7 game series if you have those guys based on how close the games actually were. But regardless, that's a huge portion of your team's payroll. And it's what likely led the Nets into a situation where the fans were upset with the lack of adjustments that Nash made to the rotation throughout that series. It's just a bad roster without those two. And isn't that great even if you have them? There just weren't a lot of moves to make. And it's a team that's just basically full of small guards and slow big men and nothing else. Adjustments wise, he pretty much tried everything he could. He ran Blake Griffin out there until Griffin was on the verge of collapsing. And he even went to this weird 4-guard lineup with Kevin Durant at the 5. And for that 4-guard lineup, it was able to keep scoring pace with the Celtics, but defensively, they were the equivalent of using wet tissue paper or wet toilet paper to try and stop a bullet. So that it didn't work out. I don't blame him for going to that lineup when wing wise, it's basically either Kessler, Edwards, or Bruce Brown. That's just not enough depth on the wing. And as good as Goran Dragic is, they really just shouldn't have cut James Johnson to make room for him. Johnson is a big physical wing, and that was something they were sorely lacking in this series, even though Dragic is a much, much better player. Then big-wise, Nash had the choice of LaMarcus Aldridge and Blake Griffin, neither of which have been good in probably 5 years. They have young big man Nick Claxton, who is as likely to make a free throw as I am winning the lottery. And then Andre Drummond, who's just been kind of bouncing around from team to team as a backup center. So none of those are really great options to go to. So what would you have wanted Nash to do? What should he have done? What adjustments should he have made? It just isn't a good team. The one area I will criticize Nash for is the lack of motion and over reliance on the star players on this team. Nash played under D'Antoni, and you can see the influence of that heliocentric offense on the Nets. Like I mentioned, the offense is just really your turn, my turn, ISOs with Kyrie and Kevin Durant, and everyone else just kind of go stand in their spot. So they also mix in like an occasional pick and roll up top with Bruce Brown doing like a short roll and either going to the basket, hitting a floater, or lobbing it to somebody like Claxton. And relying on tough 2-point shots in the half court is just that's just never going to be a way to win. So that would be my one criticism for Nash. Now, maybe that's what Kyrie and Kevin Durant want to do. Maybe this is the way that they want to play, and this isn't up to Steve Nash. If that's the case, they really need to consider reshaping this roster into more of a defensive-minded team, just a bunch of big, defensive, athletic players who can make an odd three here and there. I think that would be the way to go if it's just going to be your turn, my turn, ISOs with Kyrie and Durant, and that's all we're going to do. I think Kyrie Irving deserves a lot more blame than he's getting. I haven't seen him thrown around on ESPN hardly at all as far as being blamed for this series. And on paper, his numbers look okay, I guess. But if you go back and watch that series, he just disappeared out there far too often. It was really easy to just forget he was out there. And when you're listening to the broadcast, you can hear the announcers just keep harping on this, saying like Kyrie needs to be more aggressive. Kyrie needs to take over. They just kept saying that, and it just never happened. Obviously, Ben Simmons deserves a lot of blame. When the team made the deal to acquire him, they expected to have him and expected to actually acquire him. It just left a huge hole on this roster, and it was one that they couldn't recover from when Simmons decided he just wasn't going to show up. Looking ahead to the offseason, it might seem pretty simple for the Nets on paper. Just get healthy, bring everyone back. But as has been with the case with this Nets group all year, it's just far more complicated once you get beneath the surface. They first and foremost have a big decision to make with Kyrie Irving. And of course, it's a decision that they might not get to make if he decides to walk. I know he said he wants to re-sign with the team, but all players say that. Paul George said that he wanted to play with OKC until he retired. And then like a year later, he's demanding a trade. And then even with the Nets, within the last couple of years, James Harden said he wanted to re-sign the extension this offseason. And then a couple of months later, he was asking out. Kyrie is a different dude to begin with. So a lot can change from between now and July. So who knows what he ends up doing. If he does decide that he wants to come back, Kyrie is eligible for a 5-year, $246 million contract. And at 30 years old, are you going to be willing to give him 5 years? What is that going to look like towards the back half of that deal? Small guards, and particularly small score first guards, just don't have a history of success in this league much after the age of 30. And that's setting aside all the other nonsense you get with Kyrie Irving. So how confident are you that he's going to show up day after day? If I'm the Nets, I would seriously consider or start to consider at least a life without Kyrie Irving. As an example, Chicago's Zach LaVine is a free agent and he's looking for the max. Chicago has seemed very hesitant to give it to him, and based on what both the Bulls and LaVine are posting, it seems like they're both kind of in a place where they're going to be happy to move on from one another. So I think they should consider some type of sign and trade thing where Kyrie gets sent off somewhere else and you make room for Zach LaVine. LaVine is a downgrade, that's for sure, but he is a bigger version of the same archetype as a player, that score first guard, but you can count on him to show up for work every day at the very least. And that's not a given with Kyrie. So if I'm the Nets, I'm willing to take a downgrade in terms of talent to get a guy who's going to show up more consistently. Not show up in terms of big games, but literally just show up for practicing games, as in be in the building. And speaking of showing up for work, is there any guarantee that Ben Simmons is showing up anytime soon? Even if he does, are we sure that a New York-based team with title aspirations is going to be the best fit for him, given how he's been dealing with pressure lately? What about some type of Ben Simmons for Rudy Gobert swap? I have to imagine the Jazz are going to be entering a rebuild, or at least are very likely to want to move off of Rudy Gobert. For the Gobert side of things, he's going to add a serious defense and serious rebounding punch, and that's something that the Nets are sorely lacking. So with Kyrie / Levine and Kevin Durant, they should be fine with Gobert bringing basically nothing to the table offensively outside of a lob threat. I think that either Kyrie or Levine and Kevin Durant can give you enough of a scoring punch that you're still going to be a very effective offensive team. Other than that, just try to round out this roster more thoughtfully. I don't think that bringing in a team of slow, washed up centers and old guards is the way to go. Role player wise, in terms of what they already have on the roster, they're going to be returning Seth Curry, Day'Ron Sharpe, Cam Thomas, and Joe Harris. Those guys are guaranteed to be back unless they're traded. There's also a $6 million player option for Patty Mills that I have to imagine he's taking. I doubt he's getting $6 million from anyone else on the market. And then there's also a $1.5 million team option for Kessler Edwards. I would bring back Edwards under that arrangement. He's pretty decent from the games I've seen, and he's just a big wing, 6'8", can play either the 3 or the 4, and he shoots a pretty decent 3 ball on a decent volume given how few minutes he played. He's also super young and should theoretically be improving kind of heading into next season. I'm not going to count on him being like a starting caliber player, but at $1.5 million, there's just very little risk involved, especially since it's at a position that the Nets are desperate to get some help at. And it's a hard spot to fill. That flexible wing spot is really hard to find guys on good value guys. Bruce Brown is an unrestricted free agent this offseason. He's reportedly looking for something like $12 to $14 million per year. And I actually think you have to try and match that if you're the Nets, and just hope he shows you loyalty. Hope if you match any other offer that another team is willing to give him, that he's just willing to come back to play for you just out of loyalty. And I don't love paying Bruce Brown that much money, but there just isn't an alternative on this roster currently that can fill in for that role. And they don't have the cap room to go out and get someone else. Even if you don't like that figure, I just don't see an alternative. Claxton is a similar picture. And although I think he's less necessary as a point of emphasis compared to Brown, I still think that they might want to consider bringing him back. Claxton is a restricted free agent, so the Nets are going to have a chance to match any offer that he gets. And I think as the Nets, I wouldn't really be willing to match anything in that $10 million a year range, although I really doubt anyone is going to be offering him $10 million a year or more based on his playoff performance. If someone wants to really get crazy and offer him like a $12 to $15 million a year, I'm letting him go at that. I'm letting him walk. The rest of this free agent group, I can really take or leave, honestly. This Drummond, Dragic, Blake Griffin, and LaMarcus Aldridge group. I'm letting Blake Griffin and LaMarcus Aldridge go for sure, and that might end up being a career for both of them. I don't know if anybody's going to bring back either one of them. I think LaMarcus Aldridge is certainly going to be a career. I can see someone taking a flyer on Blake, but this is pretty much, this will probably be the last year for Blake, even if he does even get picked up. Dragic, I'm only going to bring back in the case that Mills doesn't come back. I just don't see the need for Dragic, Curry, Mills, and Kyrie on the same team. So I think either one of Mills or Dragic is fine. And Drummond, I really don't know what to do with. If he comes back for like a limited role, limited minutes on a minimum deal, then sure, bring him back. But if he's expecting like more money, more minutes, more touches, any of that, anything other than like you're guaranteed to have 10 to 18 minutes a game, I think I'm letting him walk. Outside of that, I really want to see Cam Thomas and Day'Ron Sharpe get some minutes next season. We've seen both the Nets and the Lakers this year with a team full of old geezers, as Charles Barkley likes to put it. Those teams just don't win in today's league. So getting playing time and experience to a few of those young guys you already have on your roster might make all the difference come playoff time. Both Sharpe and Thomas have shown flashes of being productive players at the NBA level. So if you're the Nets, I think you have to give them an opportunity to take that next step as a player. Other than that, they need to round out this roster with some undrafted slash G League guys, players who are going to be content just kind of running the floor, spotting up, and playing defense. Maybe you're able to find some vets willing to do that, but I would be really hesitant to do the whole old as dirt team thing over again. I just think it's so important for them to bring in guys who are going to be hungry and can bring some level of energy. And that's typically your average G League guy or undrafted rookie as opposed to your year 16 veteran. I think that if the Nets put together a more balanced roster in terms of having wings, guards, and bigs, as opposed to just small guards and slow bigs, there's no reason they can't be title contenders again next season. Only time will tell, though, with so much up in the air and so much drama entering the offseason.